Good afternoon, colleagues. As mentioned, I'm not Shamila Subramani. Unfortunately, she has extreme FOMO that she cannot be here. I am standing in her place. I'm Alex McNamara, the head of operations at the National Business Initiative. And I do have a PowerPoint slide, which is on the screen, so that's great that you can see that. So, maybe just to quickly give some background on the NBI, we've actually played in this space for some time. I don't know if you're familiar, but in 2007, we brought CDP to the South African market, or helped bring it to the South African market. So we have thought quite long and hard for a long time about the value of disclosure and asking the right questions. And so, for us, this is really, really pertinent discussion. I will build on some of the themes that have already been discussed. And my disclaimer is, obviously, as not being Shamila, all omissions, errors, and faux pas, I take full responsibility for. So the focus is, we're actually going to take a bit of a step back in this presentation, quite a significant step back in bird's eye view. Maybe it would have been even better to have it after lunch. We're going to go through some basic focus areas, but I think we're really going to start from the very beginning, if we can move. So in particular, we're going to go to the very concept of what is sustainability and move from there. And if we can, I was hoping the finger point would do the trick. And one more, please. And I think it's really to contextualize, and I think it will build on the narrative around globally relevant and locally applicable, but reminding us, where we come from in terms of what is our goal for disclosure. I guess in its purest form, we must think back to what is the definition of sustainable development. We all know this critical Brundtland report in 1987. I can't see the screen, so I'm going to turn. Can we go back for a second? Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising future generations. We're all familiar with it, but it is a critical landing point. Thank you. And I think also we really wanted to flag, in our sense, also this distinction between ESG and sustainability. And we all acknowledge the importance of enterprise value and the role of ESG, but there's also a critical landscape and requirement for the broader context of sustainability, recognizing the need to drive systemic change in society to achieve a more equitable economy and society. We'll also touch on the fact that I come from the climate change world. I spent 10 years deeply immersed in climate change consulting and was I'm a firm proponent, but have increasingly recognized that we will have to address these challenges in a systemic, integrated fashion. And if we look at, for example, achieving a just transition, just as an example, we as the NBI have clearly realized that there will be no just transition without functional local government, for example, or there'll be no just transition without water access or, of course, societal equity. So for us, this is a critical part about achieving a wider organizational societal change. Thank you, sorry. And also to understand what are the boundary conditions that we are actually dealing with, the planetary boundaries that we refer to. I think many people may be not that familiar with them. This is work that was done a few years ago, scientific research. In a nutshell, it's very hard to read on this screen, but you'll see there are a number of planetary boundaries that are indicated here. For example, climate change is one, but there's also freshwater, biodiversity, etc. Where there is a black dot in a red section, we already are in effectively Earth overshoot mode. So 7 of the 8, what they refer to as Earth system boundaries, are already being exceeded. So when we think about disclosure and reporting, it is obviously not an end in itself. It is trying to address these very, very critical planetary boundaries that we face. If we can move on. Another, I think, similar and related framework which builds on planetary boundaries, as I'm sure you might be familiar with, is the concept of donut economics. Similar sort of framework that we have an ecological ceiling, if you like, which is our outer ring, effectively the planetary boundaries. But we also have a social foundation. And the hole in the middle of the donut is the social gap. It's effectively the social conditions that we have not been able to achieve, our social shortfall. I was in India for a green economy study tour fairly recently. Very fascinating to see what you can do if you have 1.3 billion people market, by the way, for green development. But also it's just so staggering to see this is what we really have to deal with, what we have to bring billions of people out of this social shortfall at the same time as respecting planetary boundaries. Thank you. So I hope you don't mind that short segue into the broader context that we would like to put across, because we know that there are critical drivers for business, but we have to place that in a global context and a local context as well. I don't think we need to dwell too much. I think most of us are aware. We've had discussions already about some of the values that this brings for society. Risk management is critically a part of it, as is productivity and growth. This is drawn from the JSE disclosure guidelines, as many of you will probably recognize. Everything from addressing reputational and supply chain risk through to new markets, new growth, and new customers. Obviously, the mantra, from risk to value is a key kind of operating modus for many people. If we're really going to get the traction we want in this space, climate change, sustainability, systemic risk, and systemic opportunity has to be embedded in strategy. It has to be embedded in governance. And then from there, this disclosure is a key tool in achieving that objective. If we can move to the next slide. Of course, if we don't get it right, if we don't have an integrated approach, if we don't think about these kind of aspects, we can get ourselves into difficult spaces. These are just some of the examples that are very pertinent in recent times. Many examples where there is a loss of not just shareholder value and company value, but real significant social and financial value that is being lost. If we can, I think most of them you're quite familiar with. If we can move to the next slide, thank you. Of course, also, as you can imagine, potential liability, litigation, and action. For example, in the case of Shell, for while you have set a long-term emissions target, your short-term and medium-term targets do not align with what you've disclosed, with what was required by science, required by society, and puts you at potential illegal risk, if I can put it that way. Thank you. The other examples, I think, are similar. I don't think we need to dwell on them too much. I'm told I have limited time, so maybe we should skip through to the next content slide, if you don't mind. You can read the headlines for yourself. But these things making global news. Fortunately, DWS here is obviously the investment arm of the Deutsche Bank, not the Department of Water and Sanitation, in case anybody was worried. Moving on to the next slide, please. So our view is that a systemic change is needed, that we're going to, I certainly, I've worked more recently in water and have been exposed to this, so I guess I'm biased. But I have seen significant speakers say we will have to tackle climate change, water, and biodiversity in tandem. And it sounds difficult. It is quite difficult, but it is a requirement. And that will achieve the social and the economic and, of course, financial goals that we have. Reporting is definitely a way to get people to ask the right questions, to lead, to think critically. But as I mentioned before, it is not an end in itself. I think we've heard a lot about how local context is very, very important, and I think we couldn't agree more. We've done a whole bunch of work in mapping out local decarbonization pathways for our economy, and while it is achievable, it is quite difficult in some cases, but if we don't achieve a locally relevant context based on fact, we will make it difficult for ourselves. Of course, if you go back for a second. Minding the gap is recognizing that I think as much as we have a very interesting and difficult challenge in this country, again, I was in Denmark last year and I was just amazed at how easy their green transition is, really. Small country, green economy makes perfect competitiveness sense to them. They have the North Sea offshore wind at their doorstep, et cetera, et cetera. We have a much more difficult proposition. But on the other hand, I do think it's important to note that as much as we care about our story, I don't think the rest of the world will align with that. Like the world will move on. And we have to, for competitiveness, we have to move and mind the gap. And in this case, of course, a lot of it is about global best practice, things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which already places potential significant transition risk on South African companies, as you can imagine, and particularly in the heavy manufacturing sector. Thank you. So we think it's obviously about building sustainability into the core of a business, into your engagements with society. So it's building trust. It's about real critique of the business model. Is there a need for investigation of the business model? Are we considering our industry position, our policy position? Are we engaging with globally relevant best practice and locally relevant work? And are we asking the question, how is our reporting, our disclosure, our aims and objectives actually advancing sustainability impact in the country? And are we thinking in an integrated fashion? Thank you. I think this is my second to last slide. My apologies. So I think Shamila as she was coming to a conclusion, wanted to just pose a couple questions to consider in a much more sort of, I guess, overarching discussion. Why does this matter? Why are we disclosing this? What imperatives are we actually trying to advance? What entities will achieve, that have the greatest impact in achieving what we need to do? How do we measure success in terms of impact and outcome? And I guess her hint is that it's not about, obviously, the number of sustainability reports that we issue. And what is a fair and appropriate approach ultimately going to look like, thinking about, as mentioned before, cascading down to suppliers, etc. So I'll leave those with you. Her concluding remarks on the next slide, which I think addresses some of the points raised earlier, but maybe some of them are a bit different. that we think that any approach in developing mandatory reporting or voluntary reporting for that matter should really be resulting and driving clear sustainability outcomes. As a practitioner myself, we often obviously get focused on the nitty-gritty and the detail. We must always keep in mind the broader business strategy and context. Certainly we're at a critical crossroads, a number of headwinds, but hopefully this can be a supporting opportunity for us that we can actually advance the kind of impact we want to see. And I think really importantly, keeping us globally relevant. We have to remain globally relevant. We have to attract investment, and we have to build trust between business, government, and society at large. I think the point around localization has been noted. Just to say that, for example, if we look at the EU, their reporting disclosure is to fulfill the EU Green Deal. We would want to see a similar kind of vision and strategy that guides a disclosure framework. And of course, we noted earlier that there is going to be a lot of resources put into all of this. So we want it to be worth our while, essentially. And to do that, we want it to be really aligned to sustainable development and long-term growth for the country as a whole. So hopefully, this is a bit of a more contextual analysis. But I mean, if I just lastly say, as the MBI, we started off, as I said, with CDP in 2007 and disclosure. We saw how its disclosure has advanced the market. Our focus really now is actually we have to address systemic risk. We have to solve for local government capacity challenges. We have to solve for water. We have to solve for energy crisis, etc. Precisely because we will not achieve the real goals of disclosure unless we take that integrated systemic approach. Thank you very much.